Well, welcome again to another edition of AP's Profiles in Christian Living. My special guest today is Dr. Gary Millar, who's the principal of the Queensland Theological Centre, or College, I should say rather. Gary, welcome. It's great to have you with us.
It's good to be here, Mark.
Now, brother, you're from Ireland. You're living in Australia. You're the principal of our theological college up there in Queensland. What do you find are some of the differences that you've seen between living overseas in Ireland and ministering overseas and coming to Australia?
It's a tricky question. I know this may sound a bit strange, but I've been living in Dublin for 12 years. And before we moved to Australia, and in these, now almost 10 years in Australia, the sense in which in Brisbane the similarities are greater than the differences. But I think that in itself highlights some of the differences across Australia, because my experience is there's a radical difference, not just between kind of the capital cities and the regions, but actually each capital city has quite a different character. So I think one of the challenges in Australia is making statements that are actually true all the way across the nation. That's partly size, but it's also just the kind of unique history of each kind of capital city. And each feels quite different and faces an entirely different set of issues. And I think, one simple way of seeing that is, it really is the denominational strength in each capital city. It is quite different. There is no one group that's uniformly kind of strong across the nation. It's very regionally dominated. I think for me, one of the similarities in Australia is people tend not to take themselves too seriously.
Yeah.
And as in Ireland, the danger then is that if you don't take yourselves too seriously, the problem is you may not take anything very seriously. And certainly in Queensland, I think that's the single greatest challenge that we have, it's a bit like Deuteronomy. We've moved into a land, kind of trees we did not plant, cities we didn't build, and life is wonderful. And the challenge in that context is remembering the God who is responsible for it. So I think people forget much more quickly when the pressure is off.
Yeah, that's a very good observation. And sorry, I should have said more open-ended as a question. How have you found coming to Sydney, and what are some of the strengths? You've produced a number of really good books recently. The first one I'd like to talk about is this latest book, Need to Know. And I noticed that it's recommended by a lot of people that we know and respect, like Don Carson and others, calling it gentle, practical, and much needed. Why did you write this particular book?
I wrote it because no one else had. It's the short answer. I had a conversation in 2009, I think, with a guy at the book, James Burstow at the Good Book Company, who back then was answering the phones, and I was ordering Bible study resources from Dublin. And James said, we'd become friends over the years through ordering books over the phone. And James said, as a pastor, are there any books that we could that it would be helpful for you if we commissioned? And at that point, in our context in Dublin, lots of people becoming Christians, usually from a nominal Catholic background, with no real grasp of the gospel or the Bible. And over time, we tried lots of things, used Philip Yancey's Just for Starters, but there wasn't really anything that I felt worked for our people between the very simplest Bible study and then something like, knowing God or so, which was it was too heavy and too much for our people. And I just used to think it would be great to have almost like a little, kind of rules of the road thing. Here is a map, a theological map that just very simply introduces, the theological shape of the Christian life, so that you're not going to get any surprises down the track, or you're not going to, 3 years down the line suddenly wake up and go, oh, actually, God did something to me when I became a Christian. It was really him that tried to set people up well theologically without just giving, expecting far too much of them. So I actually was asked to do NTE, the FES conference, and wanted to do it on the theology of the Christian life. And in the course of that, as I'd thought through and kind of read, pretty widely and tried to crystallize my thoughts, I actually went back to James Burstow and said, "Remember that conversation we had? Did you ever get anyone to write that book?" And he said, "No. Why do you want to do it?" And I think I might, and it went from there. So in that sense, it's books come about for all kinds of reasons. That one really came about because as a pastor, I just thought, wouldn't it be so useful to have a little book that people could just have on their shelf and would set them up theologically? And I think in particular, as a pastor, I realized that so often a lot of my work was trying to get people to realize who we are in Christ and what God has done to us and for us in drawing us into his family. And so that's where I'm trying to write a basic book on the Christian life, which starts with what God has done and starts with union with Christ and being caught up in the life of the Trinity. I do think just practically, if you get that right at the beginning, it really does make everything else so much easier. And so issues like, reading the Bible, going to church, sharing the gospel, all flow out of that central theological core. Whereas I think sometimes we go, okay, now you're a Christian, here are the kind of things you need to do, which is fine for a while. And then people run out of steam and we're trying to kind of reverse engineer the motivation.
Yeah. I think that's what struck me about the book is it's really gospel saturated from beginning to end. But the other thing that I really enjoyed, I must say, is, look, you're a very good writer. It not only are you taking deep theological truths and explaining them very simply without being simplistic, but there's a lot of humor throughout the book as well. It's quite an engaging read. Do you think very intentionally about that as you write, or does that just come naturally?
I think three factors. At one level, it probably comes naturally. I think it's the positive side of what my wife would say is my inappropriate sense. I think partly it is actually it's partly a national characteristic. I think the third thing is, though, in one of the things I've realized over the years in communication and even in reading, especially writing a book like this, I've got a fairly short attention span. And I think most people have. And whilst, I certainly don't subscribe to the fact that people can't, for example, people can listen to talks that are 40, 45 minutes if they're good. Now, there are a small number of people in the world of which I'm not one, who can actually just sort of talk for 45 minutes and be inherently engaging. But for most of the rest of us, I think the secret in whether it's speaking or writing is just giving people mental breaks, changing the, sort of opening the window every so often. And I don't mean just, having a random joke or anything, but using humor and, the color of language, illustration, application, just to break up the flow of explanation, which has to be ultimately explanation is the bedrock of what we do. But if we just serve up, an enormous kind of wodge of explanation, it needs to be very good.
Yeah, well, look, in that sense, I think this is great because it's the sort of book that obviously older Christians can benefit from. But straight away I thought, this would be a great book to give away to a young Christian, a new Christian, even someone that's not a Christian. And because it is engaging, but it's not watered down. It's not superficial. So yeah, thank you.
That's encouraging. Thanks. And it has been a great encouragement to me. I've actually taken a group of new Christians through it, myself at our church.
Okay.
But just there's been a steady stream of, pastors saying, I've taken a group of people through this. A couple of times people have asked me to come and Zoom and answer some questions that a group of people in some random church somewhere have come up with reading the book. And that's been massively encouraging to see that it has actually helped people to get going in the Christian life, or actually, and I wasn't really thinking about this when I wrote it, but to also see people who've been around church forever and probably are Christian believers, but just the penny has never really dropped for them with the gospel in terms of how everything fits together. So it's been encouraging to speak to some people like that for whom it's just helped them join some fairly obvious dots, I think.
Oh, that is exciting. Another exciting thing, and this has been a real encouragement to me lately, because I've been preaching on 2 Corinthians, which is a tricky book of the Bible to preach from, I must say. I think it was Dane Ortland that said, whereas Romans is systematic in its theology, 2 Corinthians, it's deep and rich in its theology, but it just intermingles autobiography and theology from one to the other. The writer of Ecclesiastes says, of the writing of many books there is no end, and much study wearies the flesh. Why did you write another book on 2 Corinthians or a commentary?
Well, to be honest, I preached through it in College Chapel. I preach basically every week in chapel at QTC, and 2 Corinthians always frustrated me because I loved 2 Corinthians 3-5. It's almost my kind of favorite part of the Bible. In fact, behind me, actually, that I have a little. I don't have many artifacts, but I do have a little jar of clay from the 2nd century.
Fantastic.
I've always loved that, but I anytime I went to 2 Corinthians, outside those chapters, so we go, oh yeah, I love 2 Corinthians. Then I'd read it and go, I have no idea what Paul's doing here.
I'm so glad to hear you say that.
and eventually, I didn't preach through it. I'd never preached through it before. I'd done, I'd cheated and done 2 Corinthians 3-5 a couple of times. And so as I started to work on it, I just kept reading in the commentaries, the structure of this is uncertain and one of the most difficult parts of the New Testament. But as I read on, I thought, you know what, I actually think we're making a stick, to beat ourselves with here, because I don't actually think there is much of a structure. I really think it is Paul unplugged, kind of throwing the pastoral theological kitchen sink at the Corinthians. And when you actually think through the history of his relationship with him and the multiple visits and the painful visit and the letter that he didn't like talking about, that you suddenly realize here is a guy who'd planted this church, who's totally invested in this church, pouring everything he's got in trying to get them to stay on track with Jesus and the gospel. And strangely, I think that then took the pressure off, because I then became less concerned in trying to show exactly why chapter 7 follows chapter 6. Yep. Because I'm not actually sure that there is any. I think it's almost like Paul did chapter 6 and went, right, what more can I tell them to get them to stick with Jesus? Here's another one and another one and another one. And then it was actually, as I was working through that the guys at the Good Book Company said, would it be possible to do a 2 Corinthians, one of the For You series, which are lightly edited sermons, a little bit like the old Bible Speaks Today. And simply because I think I'd found there are a couple of really good commentaries on 2 Corinthians, but they're pretty turgid. Yeah. And they tend to be that, they help you understand a lot about Corinth. But I just, I didn't feel that there were commentaries out there, kind of by a preacher for preachers that would actually just say, okay, here's what Paul's doing, and here are a bunch of lines of application that you can pick up and run with. And I know that as a preacher, I value the people who do the kind of heavy lifting of the not very exciting technical commentaries for me. But alongside that, I know that what I benefit from is people who are thinking hard about how this book actually gets traction in our lives right now. And so in that sense, it's a preacher's commentary for preachers.
Yeah, look, I have a confession to make, brother, because I went to the bookstore to to pick up some extra commentaries on 2 Corinthians, and I'd seen a top 5 list, and this is only published last year. And I saw your little one on the shelf, and I thought, oh, good book company, it'll be more devotional, and I'll pick it up. It's Gary Millar, it should be good. And I must say, this is the commentary out of all of them I keep coming back to, because it is, you can tell it's been preached. It's been preached to edify the church, and it's the commentary. I've got to say, and I'm very humbled to say this, but I keep putting down your commentary to stop and pray and repent, and to ask God to really work His grace of what the truths that you're saying in my life. And I must say too, I've really appreciated the heavy lifting you've done in terms of thinking through application, in terms of putting together quotes from other authors, whether it be Calvin or someone else. So, a big thank you for that, because I think this is a real niche, isn't it? That there are a lot of technical commentaries. Like you say, they do get to be a bit turgid. But we desperately need this as preachers, don't we?
And I think, we live in a strange time just now. I mean, probably we're old enough to remember, not very long ago when we did not have a great choice of commentaries.
Yeah.
And it seems now, there are, I think about 100 good commentary series. And I think part of that is, there's a sense in which there are very few great commentaries. But our world is fragmented, and it's changing so rapidly that I think there is a place for things that aren't necessarily kind of classic books that anybody will be reading in the next 60 or 70 years, but they do speak right into our world just now.
Yeah.
And I think that's where, something like, 2 Corinthians for you, kind of fits in, that there is a sense in which it's an honest attempt to understand the text, but more than that, it's an attempt to apply the text to where we are just now with our particular kind of hang-ups and challenges, which actually are very different to those faced even, 25 years ago.
Yeah, and again, I think that's a great strength, is that you really do get a sense reading your commentary that you have one eye very much on the text, and you do. I've read the commentaries that you're referring to, and you've sorted through them, you've sifted through them, you've got the gems, but then you've done the hard work of application. And then with that, thankfully, the Good Book Company has also produced a study guide. So, a big encouragement to anybody out there thinking of doing a preaching series, 2 Corinthians, I mean, it's all there for you. You've got a great commentary, you've got a great study guide, which is just a fantastic resource for the church. Gary, can I ask you a question then? As principal of the QTC, 2 Corinthians, it's not one of the pastoral epistles, but you could say it is a pastoral epistle because it talks so much about the godly pastoral heart. How do you think 2 Corinthians is formative in shaping younger ministers in particular that you're training? What sort of priorities and emphases do you see in the book that we need to hear and apply to ourselves?
I think there are 2 standouts for us just now. Three. Obviously, the gospel is everything. The gospel, Christ is worth, dying for and living for. And I think there's a sense in which that's a perennial for every generation. I do get the sense that for our guys just now, the 2 things that are front and center in our minds as we try to equip and encourage are first the need for humility. That we serve Christ in acknowledged weakness.
Yeah.
And I think there's this, one of the reasons why we were really hard to emphasize that is that it's kind of counterintuitive in a theological college. That on the one hand, we're talking about, character, convictions, and competency, and we want to see progress, and we're pushing them and we're building them up. But that has a screaming danger of creating people who are proud and arrogant with it. So that's why we need to constantly, can just help people to face the reality that it is that Christ is strong in our weakness.
Yeah.
And I think, there's something very precious about 2 Corinthians, because it is the place, I think, where we see most of Paul, just what Paul was actually like, as an individual. And I think his deep commitment to humility. And I think the other thing is, and again, I think right now this is really important. 2 Corinthians is just a constant challenge to love people, to love the church, to love our brothers and sisters. And it also demonstrates the difference in a ministry that is marked by love. Now, again, these things that the pendulum swings. That when I was growing up, I would have said we were fairly strong on love and absolutely hopeless on strategy or gospel cutting edge. I think we're at the other. Pardon me. I think we're at the other end of the cycle. That conferences, movements, some of which I'm involved in amidst my friends, we are strong on church planting, strategic initiatives, organizing the church effectively, so that we make the most of our human resources, pipelines, ecosystems, all things that I hold dear. But the problem with all that is it's all what we do. As in we can fix it, so how do you meet the challenge in ministry? Well, you go to the ministry conference that is addressing that challenge and you learn how to do it and you come back. Now, what gets lost in all this, even as we kind of recalibrate pastoral models, what gets lost is actually that as God's people, we are called to love each other by speaking the gospel into each other's lives, but we do that into the lives of those we love. So, and I think Paul is just such a great model, that he doesn't say, your great lack in Corinthians is proper organization or, a coherent strategy for the next 5 years. He loves them. He calls on them to love him and love other people. So I think that's why it's a healthy corrective, especially in an environment where we are spending time working through lots of those other things. But I think we've lost something in our conception of what it means to be a pastor.
Okay.
I think we've added in lots of things, and I think those are important, but it's, the leader, and the strategist, and but I think we do just have to keep coming back to say, look, at the end of the day, pastor, elder, leader, however you construe that, is someone who loves God's people and is responsible to teach them and shepherd them.
Yeah. I must say that was one of the things that really struck me about your commentary. And earlier on, that was one of the things I had to just put down at one point where, and I was just trying to find the quote where you had it in your commentary. You asked directly, do you love God's people? Do you love the people that you're preaching to? I remember once a young student was being brought before the presbytery, and he was asked, why do you think God's calling you to be a minister? And he said, well, because I love to preach. He said, and this person said, one of the elders in the presbytery said, well, so do politicians. But do you love the people that you're preaching to? So humility, love, and was there a third thing that you also said?
I think that the third one was essentially the gospel is front and center. Yeah. There's just this marvelous sense in 2 Corinthians where Paul really doesn't care, despite his personal attachment. Several times he says to the Corinthians, look, I actually don't care if you reject me, as long as you stick with Jesus and the gospel. Yeah. Which in the context of a long letter, the second long letter he's written to these people, pouring out his heart. And I think even, the way in which, 2 Corinthians finishes, where he's just rejoicing over them, it's come as a rebuke. To me, because I think if I'd written the end of Second Corinthians, the tone would have been slightly different.
Yeah.
I've written 2 books of the Bible to you. You're still not on track. What's your problem?
Yeah.
So I think that's why for me it's a very arresting and deeply personally challenging book.
Yeah. Well, look, thank you again, Gary. These are wonderful resources. Again, if you're looking for a book of the Bible to be preaching on and you're thinking of a next series, 2 Corinthians, it's a fantastic commentary here by Gary Millar from the Good Book Company. 2 Corinthians, this is for you. And Need to Know, which is also, Gary, it's actually your latest book, isn't it? And it's an excellent book, especially for young Christians if you're thinking of taking people through. I've got to ask you one final question. What's the next project you're working on? Because I've been really enjoying your writing. You've also written commentaries, I know, on Deuteronomy, which is huge. But any projects that you can sort of pique our interest with?
There's a book has just been published, which is a biblical theology of personal transformation.
Wow.
Which is about how people change. And then just finished the manuscript of a kind of prequel to Need to Know, which will probably be called Read This First, which is an introduction to reading the Bible for people who really have no idea.
Okay. I only laugh because you said it's the prequel to Need to Know, and it's Read This First.
Yeah, that's right. It's but it's whether it ends up being called that. Yeah, it's just again a book. Actually, the guys at the Good Book Company said that they would love to publish a simple book like Need to Know. That will help people get started reading the Bible, because there are a few really good introductions, but they tend to have 250 pages and start using words like hermeneutics, by about page 100. This is a book that you could give to someone who's not a Christian. Even an international student who's arrived and goes, "What's this thing about the Bible?" That will set them up to read the Bible, and to get them into that. So that was good fun. That's basically done. So yeah, I never planned to do this, so I've just sort of stumbled into it. But I'm delighted just that God in His kindness seems to be encouraging people. So.
Well, look, we thank you because your writings have been a real blessing to the church and especially to me personally. So thank you, and may God continue to give you every grace and blessing to continue to produce great resources.
Thanks so much. Thanks for your encouragement, Mark.
Yeah, thanks, Gary. And that's been another edition of Profiles of AP's Profile in Christian Living. I hope you've enjoyed this time. And once again, great resources from Gary Millar, Need to Know, and also his commentary on 2 Corinthians. Look out for also the other resources that he spoke about. Thanks.